This is BBC Two.
This woman used to run the country's most prestigious local authority. Today she owes Westminster City Council £26.5 million after being found guilty of vote rigging. Branded a liar by the High Court, she's packed her bags and left the country. The Tesco's heiress, Dame Shirley Porter, now lives 2,000 miles away here in Israel. But 10 years after the Homes for Vote scandal first surfaced, her legacy in Westminster still lives on. This is most people's idea of the city of Westminster: Buckingham Palace, Trafalgar Square, Parliament, and for those who can afford it, West End shopping. But there is another side that doesn't appear in the tourist brochures. The north of the borough, around the Harrow Road, is one of the most deprived parts of London, and it's here that resentment against Dame Shirley's reign as council leader is still keenly felt. It's the annual fete at St Peter's Church near Paddington Station, and the Reverend Graham Buckle is trying to boost his church's modest income.
Yeah, you need another £4. I'm not very good with that.
Oh, get the money, get the money.
Right. She just should pay it up, shouldn't she, really? Whether she will, I think probably there's an element of something in the locality that it will never ever happen. Great shame.
He's taken a particular interest in Dame Shirley Porter and Westminster Council. He's writing about her impact on the lives of his parishioners as part of a theology thesis.
It is a small parish of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people, which protrudes like an unwanted boil on the face of Westminster City Council. The immediate local wards have always housed safe Labour majorities, so the Conservative-run council has always had a differing disposition towards the area. There's been a lack of confidence in the judicial system, and even though I suppose the local people really do feel that they have won a great long battle against her, they, there's always an element, oh well, we found her guilty but she'll never ever pay up. Perhaps that's a lost cause, sad, but it would be nice to have it, the council to have it back.
Dame Shirley's problems began back in 1986 when the Tories in Westminster came within an ace of the unthinkable, losing the jewel in the local authority crown to Labour.
Labour came within sort of tens of votes of winning the council, which would have been unheard of, and that gave Shirley Porter and her cronies, her colleagues, a real shock, and she resolved that never again would there be any chance that Labour would win. And the plan was quite simple. They would sell council properties in the marginal wards, not just the normal right to buy, but what they called designated sales. So they would sell them on the open market to people they hoped would vote Conservative.
When council flats fell vacant, instead of going to a family on the housing waiting list, they were boarded up and sold off at big discounts.
And in doing so, they effectively created ghettos in the few safe Labour wards, putting all the homeless people in those wards, in some cases in my ward, in tower blocks that were known already to be riddled with asbestos.
The district auditor, John McGill, began his marathon investigation into the policy in 1989. 7 years later, he found Dame Shirley and others guilty of willful misconduct. His 5-volume report prompted one of Dame Shirley's rare public pronouncements on the subject.
Westminster Council has always acted lawfully. We always followed legal advice. Our policies did not make a financial loss for our ratepayers, but what we did do was to promote home ownership, which was in line with government policy. The accusation that Westminster gerrymandered and that there was a Homes for Vote policy is absurd.
But the policy did have a price. The courts estimate that the cost of keeping the council flats empty, selling them to private buyers at a discount, paying to house homeless families in bed and breakfast hotels and other expenses all added up to around £27 million.
Well, I think she's a rather dealerish woman, actually. She's skullduggery complete with her, it is. I think she should come back and play some music and pay her dues.
Last Christmas, she did come home and face the music. The High Court threw out the case against 4 of her co-accused, but came to the conclusion that she and her deputy, David Weeks, were guilty. They both are hoping to have that decision reversed by the Court of Appeal.
She's a coward. She's run away. She's supposed to face it. We have to face it. We can't run.
We asked Dame Shirley if she'd like to take part in our programme, but she declined. So we decided to fly to Israel to discover for ourselves where it is she now lives.
All of her friends mentioned that in the past few years, she spends most of the time here in Israel, and her only grandchild lives here, and also her daughter.
Galit Yamini works for Israel's biggest-selling daily newspaper.
The wife of the former president of Israel is one of her closest friends, and several major Israeli businessmen are also her best friends, and also the mayor of Tel Aviv and the former mayor of Tel Aviv.
Dame Shirley Porter has swapped her penthouse flat overlooking Hyde Park for another luxury apartment, this one with a very different view. It's in Cliff Tower, behind me, in Herzliya Pituach, which is about 16 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. The guidebook describes it like this. As the city grew, that's Tel Aviv, the fine beaches here became more accessible, and luxurious homes for diplomats and wealthy Israelis were built on the slopes overlooking the Mediterranean. While Dame Shirley spends most of her time in Israel, Westminster City Council is left to deal with the legacy of her time in charge. The current Conservative leadership didn't want to speak to us either, but instead referred us to the man with the task of smoking out Dame Shirley's money.
Is Les Wright around, please? Okay. It's Bill Rhodes. When he gets back...
Bill Roots is Westminster Council's chief executive. If Dame Shirley loses her appeal, he needs to be ready to act.
We've looked to see where assets exist and where they've been distributed. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the detail of where they might be, because I don't think that's appropriate. The reason for sort of taking these steps at this stage is that it would be wrong for the council to be seen to be sitting there and doing nothing. We've said very clearly we cannot actually start recovery procedures now, but if and when it is appropriate for us to start recovery procedures, we don't then want to lose a year, say, while we try and find out where assets might be.
Council minutes show that earlier this year, the accountants KPMG were hired to help trace Dame Shirley's fortune. According to the firm's report, it did not identify any assets belonging to Dame Shirley Porter remaining within the jurisdiction of the English court, although it is by no means clear that there are no such assets. David Weeks's finances haven't come under the same scrutiny because although he's technically liable for a share of the £27 million, he doesn't own any substantial assets. The Sunday Times Rich List estimates that the Porters have amassed a £70 million fortune. Pete Sawyer is a journalist who specialises in financial investigations. He's come to Companies House in London to try and establish where that money might be.
This is the starting point for any financial investigation into a person's background. First of all, you can get details of their directorships here, and furthermore, you can get details of the companies they've been involved with. For instance, the profitability of the company, and also the shareholdings of the company as well. Let's start with Dame Shirley Porter's UK directorships. And here we are. From this list we can see that she's got 6 resignations and 1 current appointment. These companies include Lamport Developments Limited, which is a family property development company. The resignations are all in 1994, and that's around the time that the provisional findings of the district auditor would have come out. The one current appointment is the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, which is a charity, so therefore it's non-commercial.
1994 was also the year that the Porters disposed of their penthouse flat in London and their country retreat in Oxfordshire and moved to Israel on a more permanent basis. But the records show that Dame Shirley continued to hold assets in her name in this country right up until last year.
A lot of Dame Shirley's fortune was in Tesco shares because her father was the founder of Tesco's. So let's have a look at the Tesco share register and see what we find. Here's Dame Shirley's name. And if we look here, we see that sometime during the financial year ended June 97, she had just over 5.5 million Tesco shares. Quick look at the FT, and we can see that those shares, today's prices, would be worth around £10 million. However, she's closed her account by the end of the year, so the money's gone elsewhere.
Most recently, in May this year, investigators working for the council discovered that Dame Shirley owned more than 1,700 acres of forestry in the far north of Scotland. But these documents from the Scottish Land Registry show that 1 month later, in June, they were sold off for £335,000. The council's now investigating whether this was simply a coincidence.
I think Westminster does have to look at what it's done in the past to trace its assets, and when we do believe there have been times when Westminster possibly had the opportunity to get an injunction on her assets. I mean, it's one of these legal niceties that barristers argue about, but we do believe there was a possibility at some time or other when some of the assets could have been frozen, and that's why it's desperately important that they do have information about where the assets are, and they continue to make sure that the assets don't move around.
The council insists its lawyers have consistently advised that any attempt to get a court injunction to freeze Dame Shirley's assets would be fraught with difficulties.
You cannot go to the court willy-nilly and ask for one of these injunctions. You have to have a case, and the legal advice to us way back was that you'd have to wait to get it to a certain stage, and when that stage was reached, the assets had long ago been moved, so it just didn't arise. We did consider again whether we should move on a worldwide basis, but the legal advice there was that until there is a substantive court judgment here, you will not get such an injunction upheld abroad. So that's the advice we've received, and we followed it.
While Dame Shirley is able to move around the world at will, Nikki Kosh has been a virtual prisoner in her own home. She bought her flat under Dame Shirley's council house sales policy. She's finally moving out and getting married, but it's taken her 8 years to do it.
Well, I bought my flat in April 1990. Bought it under the Westminster's designated scheme. And there was a knock on my door in 1992, leaseholders in the block, who asked me the million-dollar question, how much do I think my flat was worth? And I said, oh, 60. They said, no, it's worth nothing.
As a tower block, Polesworth House didn't prove popular with private buyers. Only a handful were sold. Unknown to Nikki, the council decided to abandon the idea of selling the remainder of the flats, leaving the few who had bought high and dry.
We're all led to believe these blocks over time have become private as more and more leaseholders purchase. The banks and building societies obviously weren't happy with the situation. They stopped lending on them. Without people to borrow money to buy the flats, there was just no market for our flats at all.
Nikki wasn't alone. Hundreds of leaseholders found themselves in flats they were unable to sell. Many still face huge bills for their share of repairs to estates. She decided to mount a campaign to try and persuade the council to take them back. 8 years on, and a housing association has finally agreed to step in and buy her out.
It's like two sides of the coin, isn't it? There we are with our problems, can't sell our flats. We get major work bills for 20,000. Bills come through like confetti. She lives the life of Riley in Tel Aviv, the States. It doesn't look like she is going to pay that fine easily. I'm sure she hasn't spent it, and I'm sure it's locked away in a few bank accounts offshore where it's difficult to get hold of. It's hard to believe that somebody and go to such lengths to keep power and have no regard for any of us as people.
But in Israel, we discovered that Dame Shirley is seen in a much more positive light. A substantial part of the Porter family fortune is tied up in a charitable trust called the Porter Foundation. The accounts for last year show that it held funds of a little over £26 million. A whole host of charities benefited, but by far the biggest was this place, Tel Aviv University, which last year was granted a little over £130,000. But that's only a fraction of the millions of dollars 3 generations of Dame Shirley's family have donated to Tel Aviv University. The Porter name can be found all over the campus. Here, as elsewhere in Israel, she's very much among friends.
We are in the zoology department, and we are in the marine biology section of it, which is part of the Porter Supercenter for Ecological and Environmental Studies. She's known in the university as an important donor to the university and as a patron of the environment in many ways, at least in Tel Aviv University.
We are waiting for the results of the appeal. We are not judging any person while the process is going on. We find this family's involvement in very special in its depth, in its scope, and its the length of the involvement for so many years.
And given the problems that Dame Shirley has back in the UK, you have no plans to sever that involvement?
We have no plans at all.
What did Dame Shirley's friends here in Israel think of what happened in Westminster?
They actually do not really care for what happened in Westminster. They all believe that it's a political scheme, and they all prefer to accept her version for what happened. They say that it happened far away from Israel, and they really don't know the exact details. And they believe her, and they trust her, and they believe that she's a very honest woman.
So, apart from the millions in the Porter Foundation, where is the rest of Dame Shirley's money? The council documents record that it is likely that assets exist in various countries abroad and in trusts, etc. The council has taken the step of employing a specialist team of forensic accountants to make further inquiries.
I have another firm, an international firm, whose name I will not disclose, who are taking this further and reporting through to our legal advisors, who again are external, in terms of what stages have been reached and whether there is anything else we should do at this stage. But the honest answer is I do not believe there is until the court action is concluded.
Professor Michael Power is a former auditor who now lectures on accounting at the London School of Economics.
If the person is determined to hide the assets, then clearly the trail is a very complex one. So it's tough in that sense. It's also essential to get a complete overview of the transaction. It's very easy to look at the parts and not appreciate the true significance of individual documents, bank statements, and so on. So it's really necessary to kind of build a whole picture. That's a very time-consuming process, and it also requires a lot of experience and imagination.
Over the past few years, it's clear that the Porter family's financial interests have spanned a large part of the globe, and as well as the UK, have included places like Israel, the United States and Switzerland. They've also involved some well-known offshore tax havens, including Jersey, Guernsey, Panama and the British Virgin Islands.
Individuals with high worth have the resources to structure their financial lives in such a way that it is difficult, that they're not very transparent. If you can hold your assets, for example, in a private company overseas with very poor disclosure and transparency rules, then it's actually very difficult to trace both ownership and the nature of the assets in question.
I always think Dame Shirley has been extremely well advised, and perhaps that's not surprising in the circumstances.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, if you or I were in a similar position, wouldn't you seek as best you could, I think I would as a human being, to protect myself?
While in Tel Aviv, we decided to try and approach Dame Shirley directly to ask her whether she ever intended to pay up.
Hello,
Hello, can I speak to Dame Shirley Porter, please? This time she offered a written statement, handed to us by a member of staff. And it includes the following. I trust viewers will be told that the Westminster case is political from start to finish. This case is not about anything criminal or about any personal financial wrongdoing or gain. And it ends, I've done nothing wrong, and I intend to fight this case every step of the way. And that could prove a very long and very drawn-out affair for everyone involved.
If the Court of Appeal decision is itself challenged, and it might be, there are important questions of law that might arise on this, in which case it'll go to the House of Lords. But even after that process is exhausted, and there is a definitive order to pay, the question of enforcement might well raise all sorts of problems. If the Council were to decide to try to enforce that abroad, then I've no doubt that there would be quite extensive proceedings there. So I don't think it's over in the short term.
And that could prove an expensive business. The Council's already spent £3.5 million on the case, the District Auditor £2.4 million. There's still the cost of the appeal, and that doesn't take into account Dame Shirley's legal fees, which some estimates put at more than £1 million, all of which opens up the possibility of a deal being struck. Have you been in touch with Dame Shirley and her lawyers at all?
Yes, we've obviously exchanged correspondence in a formal way periodically on different aspects of the case, and I have met her myself informally recently, really to go through our respective positions. I see nothing at all wrong with that. I think that's a common sense way to proceed.
Was there talk of a deal on the table?
Well, I'm not going to go into the details of the conversation.
Would you consider doing a deal?
Well, it's something it may be appropriate in the fullness of time. You say I mean, I will have to deal with this and also advise the council. Ultimately, it will be up to the council members as to what, if any arrangements were appropriate. But I really don't want to talk about that at this stage.
But if you were looking at this as a normal debt, presumably you'd have to balance how much it would cost you to get the money back.
Yes, I would. But when I pursue a debt, I always start on the basis of like 100%.
The Kamara family are taking a particular interest in the outcome of Dame Shirley's case. Back in 1989, while she was leader, the council housed them in a tower block that was known to be contaminated with asbestos. Their son, Bilal, was a newborn baby.
We were never told. We were only told to go to Westminster Council and collect the keys. There was no mention of asbestos.
A report into the decision to house homeless families in Hermes Point concluded that it was influenced by considerations of party advantage. Dame Shirley has always insisted that she knew nothing about the asbestos, but the Kamaras think that she should still take responsibility for the council's actions.
I came from work one afternoon and found men in space suits in front of the communal areas, the landing just in front of the lift. I spoke to one of the men. I said, why were you all walking in those suits when we passed by, you know, without suits? And the man said, ask your council.
Yes,
a subsequent investigation concluded that the asbestos posed little risk to the tenants' health, but Bilal suffers from breathing problems, and although there's no proof of a link, the family can't help worrying.
Every time my son has an illness, has a cough, I rush with him to the hospital. I ask for blood tests. I get worried unnecessarily sometimes, you know. That is what I have to live with.
How would she feel now that we're having to carry such a heavy burden in our minds for our son, Bilal?
I think it is really a scandal that she should be living the kind of lifestyle she's living now when she's made people who were placed, trusted in her care, you know, their lives such a misery.
But is it realistic to expect anyone to willingly come up with £27 million when the original offence didn't involve any financial gain? Back in the mid-80s, Labour councillors in Lambeth and Liverpool had to pay several £1,000s each for refusing to set a rate. There are plans for future cases like Dame Shirley's to be dealt with under criminal rather than civil law. The burden of proof would be much higher, but the penalty could be jail.
If Dame Shirley Porter were to be found guilty under the new system, two things would be true. First, she would be found guilty in a court. Our view was that it was not appropriate that the district auditor should be both prosecutor and judge. He or she should be prosecutor, but the prosecution should take place before the ordinary courts. And then, in our view, the range of penalties should be the kinds of penalties you would expect in connection with a criminal case, and that could involve Dame Shirley Porter or any one of a large number of other people, if found guilty of a sufficiently serious offence in the ordinary courts, going to jail.
Although many of Dame Shirley's supporters were unwilling to take part in the programme, they say the huge Conservative majority in Westminster is a complete vindication of her actions. Today, Labour fill just 13 of the 60 council seats.
Some people would say, looking at the election results, that it clearly shows the majority of people in Westminster are happy with the way Dame Shirley and her successors have run the council.
I think you can agree that maybe there is a Conservative majority in Westminster, and there are a lot of rich areas. Westminster does, after all, cover Knightsbridge, Belgravia, Mayfair. I mean, there are a lot of people who are happy and are not poor. What we've always maintained, there are a sizable number of people, if a minority, but a sizable minority of people in desperate housing need, unemployed, in areas crying out for regeneration, and Westminster has ignored them.
A final fax to try and persuade Dame Shirley to speak to us resulted in a phone call from her.
People back in England wonder whether if you do lose the appeal, you would consider paying the money. What's your response to that? It's all in your statement. You've got nothing to add. All right, Dame Shirley, goodbye.
And on that question, Dame Shirley's statement says, "I have always settled my debts."
It would certainly seem that Dame Shirley Porter is unwilling to answer any questions, at least until after the Court of Appeal hearing sometime next year. Here in Israel, her reputation remains very much intact. That's not the case in London, where she is still someone who lied about her attempts to try and rig the local elections, and she still owes the people of Westminster £26.5 million.
Nikki has now left Polesworth House and started a new life. She's moved to Lewisham to try and banish unhappy memories of her time in Westminster.
I hope that her guilty judgment stays with her, that she can never come back to this country and be a councillor again, never have that position of responsibility, never be in a position of power where she can abuse and manipulate people.
Well, knowing the contacts she may have and the fact that she's got money, I won't be surprised if she wins the case. But I hope she doesn't. I sincerely hope she doesn't.
I mean, that's a sad legacy she's left behind. You know, for so many years we had somebody who was manoeuvring and actually not being the true council leader that she should have been, really. I'm sure she'll probably get away with it. I hope she doesn't. But I think probably she will.
Tracy and Sydney hear things that they'd rather not, and the noises that they make are entertaining and annoying their neighbours in equal measure. From bedroom antics to bathroom habits, nothing is private. Next week, First Sight opens the door on their fight for the right to a little peace and quiet.